Hello everyone. Welcome back to a new episode of Europe Responds, which is the EU-ISS series that looks at the issues on Europe's strategic horizon and their relevance to the EU and its member states. I'm Giuseppe Spatafora, the host, and today's episode is Democracy Under Attack, Election Interference in Moldova and Beyond. I'm joined by two esteemed colleagues, Ondrej Ditrych, who is the senior analyst on Russia and the Eastern Neighbourhood at the EU-ISS, and Ondrej Kovalcikova, who is the senior analyst on transnational security. And together we'll be talking about yesterday's parliamentary election in Moldova, its effects on the country, and its relevance for the EU and its strategic objectives in the Eastern Neighbourhood. But we'll also talk about the implications of the election for the fight against foreign interference and disinformation in broader democratic processes. As you know, Moldovans voted yesterday in the parliamentary election, and this happened almost 1 year after the presidential election that re-elected Maia Sandu. And once again, this election was marred by accusations of Russian foreign interference on a massive scale. And yet, the results seem to award a significant victory to the pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity. So quite a lot to unpack. Here, I will start with a question for Ondrej, who, by the way, is about to publish a commentary on the EU-ISS website, so don't miss that. But Ondrej, give us a preview. How do you interpret the results? Why should we care? What is the significance for Moldova, of course, but also for the EU more generally?
Right. Thank you very much, Giuseppe, for the question. And, hello, everyone. So very briefly on the outcome of the election, and then we can perhaps discuss briefly the geopolitical repercussions. So this was the third time that Moldovans went to the polls in a year. There was a presidential election and referendum last October, and now we had the parliamentary election yesterday. And in that election, the Party of Action and Solidarity, the governing party, managed to secure again a simple majority in the parliament. Looks like they will get 55 out of 101 seats, which is less. So the majority is narrowing. It is less than they got in 2021. That was 63, but it's still fairly comfortable. And then there will be 4 opposition blocks in the parliament as well. So the way we got to this, and it was by no means, let's say, a straightforward victory for the PAS. PAS has been actually losing support over the last period. In the end, they managed to actually get more votes because there was more mobilization, but less support overall. Well, since 2021, there was really this sort of perma-crisis that the government had to grapple with, in addition to this massive hybrid campaign that we will talk about in a minute. But the perma-crisis in the form of the pandemic and its fallout, and then perhaps as importantly, if not even more, the fallout of the war in Ukraine, the massive inflation, which is now under control, but still the real wages and pensions haven't sort of caught up with this. So it would be unfair, of course, to blame it squarely on the government. This kind of poor, economic indicators and performance. But the fact is that part of the citizens, part of society see this kind of socioeconomic situation the country is in addition to not always effective governance and endemic corruption, as being the responsibility of the party. So what PAC has tried to do to address this, first, they increasingly rely on the diaspora as its key support constituency. In the last year's presidential election, 83% of the Moldovans living abroad voted for Maia Sandu, the PAC founder. she won the presidency for the second time. This time around, it looks like some 78% of those living abroad voted for the PAC again, and there was a rising number of polling booths opened abroad. Only two in Russia, though. So that is sort of one strategy, and the other is sort of doubling down on the sort of geopolitical narrative, portraying the contest as sort of the moment of decision for the country's future, a geopolitical choice between the East and the West. And there is something about this. I mean, there is this hybrid campaign that we will be talking about. The message strikes a chord also because the opposition blocs do have their own, sometimes quite murky ties to Russia, to the Kremlin, but also it's not really the whole story, because it really looks like the voters were less concerned about this big geopolitical question and low wages, pensions, unemployment, corruption, and so forth. But in the end, PAC pulled it off, and here we are. And perhaps if I can just very briefly continue what this really means. So yes, we have or we are likely to have a government in Moldova which will be supportive of the European integration of the country. As you know, Moldova has a candidate status since 2022. The accession process is not really moving forward. Moldova did complete the bilateral screening process with the European Commission last week, if I'm not mistaken. But it's sort of a hostage to the unresolved disputes concerning Ukraine's accession process and the question of opening the accession talks. But we have a government that is supporting of the European path, that is trying to engage in reforms, and we sort of avoided sort of replication of a Georgian scenario, if you will, in the Eastern neighborhood. So here I stop. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Ondrej. Thanks for giving us the context that goes beyond the events of yesterday and of the past weeks. That tells us why we got here. Now, let me turn to Nadia. And indeed, we talk about the big issue that was in the front pages of many newspapers, the basically electoral interference by Russia. So I wanted to ask you, as the expert of foreign interference, what do we know about the tactics that the Kremlin used, its playbook, if you will? I wanted to ask if these threats are the same, or you feel that they're different than usual, and also how Moldova dealt with it.
Thanks so much, and good afternoon to everyone. Absolutely, I think Russia's playbook has been very well deployed this time again. It's a huge and growing playbook, and I think Russia has proven many times that this playbook is reusable in almost any elections and keeps extending it with different operations. What we have seen that happened in Moldova, and I just like to emphasize that, as also Ondrej mentioned, this is already third elections within 1 year, and these elections periods that are so close together have very clear also spillover effect of usage of different operations. So basically building up, Russia has been very well building up on its previous efforts last year, such as, for example, the networks that they have built during the European referendum and presidential elections last year. Russia has spent approximately 1% of Moldova's GDP on these operations, which is around 150 million of euros, which is a huge amount that only could be used further also for the impact during this election. So you can see the amount of money, the millions of euros really spent on these operations within 1 year, definitely is showing how Russia takes these operations very seriously and is willing to pay a lot of money to swing the votes or influence and polarize the voters. What happened very practically, we have seen also paid activists to create inauthentic accounts over various platforms, social media networks. Around 90 such fabricated accounts within a broader operations of networks have been created. So-called digital armies have been deployed. We also have seen the creation of these new info leaders, and these new info leaders, influencers, around 200 of them have been also recruited to basically create new content and amplify it within the networks, both domestically but also in a broader way to influence Moldovan voters, not only in Moldova but also in other countries. And another technique of Russia's playbook was to even bring people in other countries, such as in Russia or the EU or elsewhere, to go to the polling stations, pay them for pro-Russian vote or related vote or anti-EU vote, or the way they framed the whole campaign. We have also seen evidence of training Moldovans abroad and elsewhere to incite mass riots just before the elections. And the Moldovan authorities did over 250 raids just before the elections, few days before, to try to block such mass riots. So we really see that this Russia's playbook has been very large. There have been also cyber operations, and this also happened last year during the elections, and the cyber hacktivists also even admitted last year to be deployed and linked, and links to Russia have been proven. So this is really a very full-scale operation going much beyond these information campaigns. There is a fraud, there are cyber operations, there's the propaganda and hire, and all of these different tools are deployed with a lot of money in Moldova within the last year. So what has been done, it's always tricky, right, to do something new or try to be as effective against in response to these operations. But I think prior to these elections, with the experience of the European referendum and presidential elections last year, Moldovan authorities were quite well aware and well prepared and deployed this type of also European tools, such as the pre-banking, to build societal resilience, and we're informing the citizens, the voters, prior to these elections, what are going to be the narratives probably spread again. They were informing publicly already from the presidential office, but also the media and elsewhere, that these operations are happening. So the transparency measures were deployed to showcase people to not be surprised or also not be misguided by these operations in advance prior to the elections, so they could build their resilience against such interference activities of Russia. I think what's also very interesting and important, and it's not completely new, but we see it increasingly more across different countries, is also these interconnections between the foreign and domestic forces that are leveraging. And we saw as well how some domestic groups have been reinforcing the Russia's narratives, amplifying them even further, and that really increases the impact of such operations with these local actors, local networks that are being also deployed, these proxies as well, that contribute to the effectiveness of such operations. So I think this is all the mixture maybe of all the new, maybe on the newer side as well, what I found quite interesting and the scale of the technological use was this creation of hashtags, digital hashtags, with over 20,000 of such hashtags to really create certain trends online, but also be able to measure the impact, that you can prove the reach, and the reach of these digital armies, these info leaders, these hashtags, coordination networks has really reached millions, I would say hundreds of millions viewers, resharing across different platforms, mostly TikTok, Facebook, Telegram, but also Instagram and other also more local networks and platforms. So we have seen this newer scale, really large scale of the digital operations, these newer hierarchical structures where you need to be first an activist within this kind of network that is being created in order to grow up into an info leader. So there is this new also incentive to grow within your circles. It's very organized, has been really building up. And I think very importantly, to showcase the scale of these operations, it was not in Moldova in isolation only. A lot of these networks, a lot of these narratives that were being used, they were already used in Ukraine as well for a long time, but also elsewhere. And they were just repurposed, and they were made more fit for this context. And we have been identifying these different narratives and different networks used, for example, in Ukraine recently, now repurposed for the elections in Moldova. So a lot of old things, but also quite a few new things, but the scale really grew, and the money that has been invested in proportion to the 2.3 million of population of Moldova is really immense.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you, Nadia. You shared the fact that some of these tools are fungible, and the responses can also be fungible. So we learn each time, but also that there's new things. And I want to piggyback on this idea of scale to talk about the broader context in which the election took place. And I'm going back to ask Ondrej about the broader hybrid campaign that Russia is carrying out. And this may be connected to broader issues such as the incursions into NATO territory, sabotage attempts, continued probing, and of course, the war in Ukraine that continues. So the question that emerges here is whether these issues are connected to the Moldovan election, at least from Russia's strategic viewpoint. And if I may piggyback on that, there's also a question from the audience. And by the way, everyone can ask questions. We'll try to we pick some of them. There's a question about Ukraine's own interest and the effects of the election on Ukraine. So here it is to you, Ondrej.
Thank you, Giuseppe. I think Nadia did quite good justice to sort of the diversity of the tactics deployed to mess with the elections, to interfere, to discredit, to delegitimize. And here I think we are really going to see claims of the elections being rigged, voters intimidated, partly supported by inauthentic content. We already see some of the parties saying, look, within the sort of Moldova territory, we actually won, and there were these manifold bomb threats reported in the voting booths abroad. So yes, as Nadia said, it's sort of this hybrid of old-fashioned and new AI enhanced, but also a lot of money changing hands, cyber attacks, and yes, indeed, Giuseppe, I think it is correct to see this as part of a broader toolbox or assemblage of hybrid practices used by Russia and its proxies to delegitimize, to gain influence, to restore influence over Eastern Europe. Moldova was a Soviet republic once, but I'd say in the case of Moldova, one of the reasons, of course, why Russia is so invested in this, and yes, it doesn't really have to spend so much money on this, is that yes, it is a small republic in the Eastern Europe that decided to get on the European path, but it's also because Moldova offers, excellent laboratory conditions. We speak, and rightly so, about Moldova as this kind of laboratory of Russian hybrid. But this is one of the reasons why it is the case, because there is, poor economic performance, poor governance, or not always effective governance, corruption, and it just makes it easier for Russia's interference. But it is certainly part of this broader picture. At the same time, I would sort of consider it not necessarily correct to see this as all sort of synchronized, and orchestrated. Yes, of course, it's connected because it's part of this very dense web of relations and of actors acting in one way or another. Some political entrepreneurs, some security intelligence services, proxies like Ilan Shor, the renegade entrepreneur in Moldova, acting in support of Russia's interests, but not always in entirely synchronized synchronized way. But I would say with a sort of overall strategic objective of increasing, pushing, for influence, provoking and undermining and delegitimizing liberal forces in the neighborhood and in Europe at large. So as to the question that was asked by one of our viewers, I think in case this was actually spelled out by Ukrainians, in case there would be either a victory of, let's say, overtly pro-Russian forces, or in the sort of descent into protracted instability, this would make things difficult for Ukraine, because it would have to tie more of its already limited resources to defend against perhaps not, let's say, opening another front from Transnistria, from the separatist region. Maybe that would be a bit of a stretch, but certainly, an increased hybrid activities from this vector, paramilitary style. So there would be increased risks, just like Ukraine has to tie some of its resources to the border with Belarus. This might suddenly be the case also here, but it doesn't, fortunately, look like it's going to be the case.
Excellent. Thank you, Ondrej. And well, speaking of context, the growing interference dynamics that Russia is pursuing seems to be taking place in an area where there could be a potential vacuum, because the EU is still there, but the United States has taken a new stance on disinformation. It has decided not to continue funding a lot of counter-disinfo programs, partly as part of the cuts to US AID, but also beyond that. So then this is a theme that is quite important. In fact, it's relevant also for our research, for the upcoming Chaillot paper on transatlantic relations that the USS will be publishing in 2 weeks. But sticking to this theme of disinformation in the neighborhood, Nadia, how do you think that the EU can step up in countering the threats that are, as we said, are growing, where potentially the biggest ally may not be contributing as much? So what's in it for us?
I think EU is very much aware how much needs to be done, and even more than before. And when it comes specifically, for example, to Moldova, EU has been invited by the Moldovan authorities to send its personnel to a newer, at that mission, new CSDP, Common Security and Defense Policy civilian mission to Moldova, because of the very fragile information environment, the upcoming elections, the overall Russia's aggression against Ukraine, but also against European values, and right on the border of the EU as well. So this, for example, approach of helping to build capacities to Moldovan authorities to build resilience against such FIMI, foreign information manipulation and interference, or cyber operations, or broader interference, has been one of the tools that EU has deployed to also, for the first time, actually support authorities, in this case Moldovan, with a hosting and with the mission in the country to help build those capacities. I think that's a very interesting example as well. We have also published at the EU-ISS on that, how this example of the mission could potentially be a role model in one or the other way for maybe also future or ongoing missions elsewhere, as these trends and these operations by Russia, but also other actors, have been increasingly more present, and not only during the elections. So this is one way how EU can also continue stepping up to use the lessons and the good practices identified through this endeavor, also perhaps in other missions or in other countries who would express interest. Also, we have seen a lot of these operations, even though they happen both online and offline, offline in fabricated documents, and also in different deployment of different networks, also underground. The mass riots were mentioned, the hire for the vote as well, just people being paid for voting certain way, etc. So this happens also offline, but a lot of these operations happen online, and therefore there is a role of these platforms as well, of these social media companies, where EU as well has adopted the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, upcoming Media Freedom Act as well for the different media outlets and newsrooms. And this is also one way to ensure that the implementation of these already developed and adopted regulations is implemented, that these are implemented in an effective way, that these different private actors as well are also accountable when it comes to this public electoral processes, democratic processes, and other types of institutions. So one way also for the EU is just to continue within these ongoing efforts and also make sure that the regulation that has been adopted is also being implemented and followed, and if not, that there are certain accountability measures for that. And perhaps maybe just third one, because there is also so much we could do, but I think it's very important to see these operations in the integrated way. As I mentioned, we have not only seen the disinformation campaigns, we have also seen cyber attacks, we have seen fraud, we have seen different incitement for violence. And I think seeing these operations in this interconnected way and integrating policies to respond and to also develop longer-term strategies against to prevent, mitigate, or even deter such operations is critical. So we don't see these operations in isolations, as you said, countries in vacuum or elections in vacuum, but neither having the responsibility in vacuum and having these both EU or national, but also multilateral approaches in this integrated way. So we are more effective when we counter these different activities of foreign interference.
Very good. So essential to keep connecting the dots, and it seems that the EU has, stepping up is doing its job, and clearly the threats will not disappear. So that remains essential. Now we have 4 minutes. There's not much time, but if there are questions for the audience, we're more than happy to take them. We do have one question that touches on some of the points that Ondrej made about the follow-up to this election. Basically, it's not over. And the question basically is whether the protest could turn violent. So basically, could we see the Georgia scenario reversed with a government that seems to have won election legitimately, and the population that is sort of pushed by election denial claim to revolt? So Ondrej.
Okay, first let me just underscore that the protest in Georgia is peaceful. Of course, the people who meet in the streets of Tbilisi have been for more than 300 days have not, turned to violence. But to your question, of course, there were news of this network being discovered and dismantled of Moldovan citizens trained in Serbia. This kind of shadowy network, probably with tentacles leading to GRU, Russia's military intelligence. So yes, that's absolutely relevant question. The short answer is I don't expect the protest to turn violent. I think it's more of a low probability scenario. It is true that we will see attempts and are already seeing attempts at delegitimizing the election, and this is where Russia's messaging also comes in. Peskov made a statement today. I think we have to let Moldovans sort this out. But we see that some of the opposition are saying that many people were not allowed to vote, that it was not a fair vote. So yes, we will see. I think probably less than less probably than sort of the protests, mass protests are turning violent and attempts to sort of overthrow the government. Is sort of constant pressure seeking to further delegitimize the institutions of the state, to increase the mistrust and to sort of tear Moldovans apart. This is, I think, the more likely risk, and I think it will be very important, and it will be a challenge. And it's not just a challenge for the Moldovan government, but it's a broader challenge in the face of these pressures, to respond appropriately, but also respond in a way that actually does safeguard the liberal values that we stand by.
Indeed, as you say, this is not over. This tension may continue. They go well beyond election day, and unfortunately, this is a pattern that may repeat itself elsewhere, as it has. And that's why it is essential for the EU to remain an active actor in that neighborhood and to use all its tools at its disposal to keep supporting Moldova and other countries in their path towards their democratic future, hopefully within Europe. Now, on that note, I think we can close this episode. This is all the time we have. I want to thank our two speakers and great colleagues, Ondrej and Nadia, for sharing their expertise with us. Once again, do stay on the lookout for the publications, both in the fields of hybrid threats and foreign interference, and on the field of Russia, Eastern Neighborhood, support to Ukraine, and as I said before, the commentary on the elections, which is about to be published. And to conclude, stay in touch for future episodes of Europe Responds. We hope to see you again there, and thank you for listening.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.